GURPS is a generic universal system. It's in its name. It doesn't have to be about combat, but most games feature combat encounters. So how do you balance your combat encounters? In D&D you could use the monster's challenge rating, which from my personal experience was not a good measure of combat effectiveness. What do you use in GURPS? What you definitely shouldn't use to measure combat capabilities is character points. First, enemies rarely even have point totals. And second, due to the generic nature of the system, point totals simply do not work that way. The famous example is a 200-point lawyer, with most of his points spent on social skills and contacts, versus a 25-point warrior with actual combat skills. Pyramid 377 has an article that provides a means to calculate the so-called combat effectiveness rating that can serve as a replacement for the D&D challenge rating. However, there are some problems with it. First, it doesn't take gear and specific weaknesses into account properly. Second, it doesn't take player skill, not character skill, into account. Third, it involves a lot of math. Personally, I am not averse to math, but combat effectiveness rating calculations take a long time, so they can only be done in advance, while many of combat encounters in GURPS usually are just thrown together during the game itself. I do not really like combat effectiveness rating, I don't think it works well. How do you balance your encounters then? Since you have no abstract measure of combat capabilities, you can use the player characters as a benchmark. Think about the following parameters of the party: head count, movement speed, skill with primary attacks, damage with primary attacks, best useful active defenses, DR, HP, rolls to resist being taken out. If the enemies will have roughly the same statistics, then the fight will be equal. If you want to make the fight easier, you should make the enemies inferior in more areas than they are superior. And if you want to make the fight tougher, you should make the enemies superior in more areas that they are inferior. For example, a party of adventurers fighting a group of bandits on the road with the same statistics is fair, but such mirror matches might be boring. You can keep the fight fair by reducing a certain number of capabilities, but increasing an equal number to compensate. For example, the enemies might have higher strength or weapons that deal more damage, but have lower skill, or they might have less DR and HP, but have higher movement speed and head count. But of course, this is just a general method, as there are always special cases. For example, the battlefield itself is an important part of the fight. If, for example, it is full of sand, that is difficult terrain for the player characters, but all enemies have terrain adaptation sand, then they will have an important superiority that wasn't on the list before. The same applies to things like darkness and night vision. If the enemies have ranged weapons and the PCs don't, then it's another superiority. Flight, insubstantiality, abilities that negate abilities of the other party, all that can affect the difficulty of the fight. I suggest taking great care when introducing foes with insubstantiality or injury tolerance diffuse. Make sure that the PCs can even interact with them, and that the chances of winning do not hinge on just one character. There is one important aspect that I mentioned before, but that I want to emphasize again: player skill. This is very important. Players that are not experienced in GURPS combat may not know how to deal with certain situations and what actions are optimal. The same applies to the GM too. A new GM might be unable to get the most out of the enemies he is throwing at the PCs. For example, in the current game I am running, where half of the players are new to GURPS, the first fight that was intended to be quite easy almost resulted in a TPK. Usually, when I run a GURPS game, I make the first couple of fights relatively easy to gauge the combat capabilities of the player characters and the skill of the players themselves. After that, I adjust the difficulty as I see fit. In some situations, you can even adjust the difficulty when the fight is still ongoing. The players do not know what the enemy's skills are, what kind of powers they might have, and what their HP is. But be careful with it, do not overdo it. I have played with a GM who was very afraid of actually harming the PCs. Many fights started with enemies overpowering the player characters, but then they suddenly changed their tactics, become more stupid, make all-out attacks in situations when they are unreasonable and deadly to them, or die in a single weak hit, when before we had trouble in penetrating DR. This really took the wind out of my sails, and made me much less invested in the game. What are the stakes if the GM keeps coddling you like that? But I and some other players discussed that with the GM, and he changed his approach. He is much better now. Some of the points in this video were taken from How to be a GURPS GM Combat Encounters. This small book is very useful, and it's actually system agnostic. You can use advice found in it when running games in other systems. The book delves into what I told you about in much more detail, and I highly recommend you read it. However, there is a problem. I have no idea how one can even procure it nowadays legally. This book used to be part of a Warehouse 23 summer sale that you got for free if you spent more than $30 on the books. Or you could get it through a Kickstarter campaign, but now you cannot even buy it. Personally, I think that it's a stupid decision on SJ Games' part. Why hide such a good book behind these complicated limited access schemes? This is a kind of a book that would help attract new players and GMs if it was made free. Sometimes I'm not sure if SJ Games has a penchant for unreasonable business decisions, when it comes to GURPS at least, or if it's just me not understanding how business works. But anyway, encounter balance is more of an art than a science, and it will come with experience. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.